That 4.7. Anyway, so I like old, uh, old 50s style television. One of my greatest, or one of my favorites, is Perry Mason. Perry Mason is, in essence, the good lawyer. Perry Mason will do just about anything he can in order to help his clients in the court system, whatever ways he can come up to the legalities. Raymond Burr was a brilliant Perry Mason. He was chosen by Earl Stanley Gardner as being the person to be Perry Mason. But every great actor needs a foil. And so the foil was this person, Hamilton Berger, played brilliantly by William Talman. So William Talman played the district attorney of Los Angeles, and Perry Mason played the defense attorney. They played across each other brilliantly. And I strongly argue that the new Perry Mason shows during the 80s and 90s didn't work quite simply because they did not have a protagonist like Hamilton Berger. So I'm going somewhere with this, but I kind of want to lead you in a direction so that you'll kind of understand this part of the lesson a little bit better. So this is kind of the arguing that goes on between the two of them during the discussion.
Your Honor, I object. Counsel for defense is up to his usual grandstand. Objection. Your Honor, once again, Mr. Mason is demonstrating his characteristic courtroom pirate techniques.
Your Honor, it's perfectly obvious that Mr. Mason's been up to one of his usual tricks.
Oh, Your Honor, I object. That's incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial. It's also improper cross-examination. I object, Your Honor. This is improper cross-examination. It's incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial, in that it assumes a fact not in evidence.
Objected to is argumentative, assuming a fact not in evidence, leading and suggestive, and utterly incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial.
Stand.
Yes, Perry won quite a few of them, okay? However, Hamilton Berger in season 3 had a friend who was accused of murder. And who did he call on? He asked Perry Mason. He asked him to represent him. And Perry gratefully accepted. And at the end of the case, those two people that were arguing at each other, this is what they did at the end of that show.
You know, I think I won this case.
So I kind of wanted to show you this to kind of set this thing up and to talk about conflict and kind of dovetail with our court system. Our court system is built on conflict. Prosecution and the defense, and the prosecution must provide guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not shadow of a doubt, but reasonable doubt. Conflict works. Conflict in this system works because they're both pursuing one goal. Perry and Hamilton, they're pursuing justice. And so many times, as soon as Hamilton figures out what Perry has seen, he immediately flips and goes along with Perry. So I kind of want this dovetail is to set it up to understand and talk about conflict now in a somewhat more liberated way. All right. So conflict. Let's start talking. So what is conflict? Conflict is a state of opposition, of discord among organizations in the marketing channel you could say conflict goes on even further than that. We have kind of walked around the whole concept of conflict since the very beginning. What I'm here also to say is that conflict is not necessarily wrong. It is expected between independent organizations. And yes, a certain amount of conflict, believe it or not, is desirable. Conflict arises when one member of a channel views its upstream or its downstream partner as an adversary or even an opponent. It is different than competition. In competition, it is a behavior where one channel member seeks to obtain a goal to the detriment of his partners, their partners, excuse me. And so the definition that you would use for the test is it is a behavior by a channel member that is in opposition to the wishes or behaviors of its channel counterpart. Now, conflict, like any tool, depends on its use. Conflict, as I've said, can be bad, and we'll talk about it. When it is bad, it is awful, and we'll talk about when it is constructive and useful. I'm not saying conflict can be good. I'm just saying it can be useful. Conflict moves through 4 stages, and this drawing is not quite correct. It goes this way, like a Z pattern, from one stage to the other. So the first is latent conflict. This is conflict that arises in the normal day-to-day interactions that we perform. Conflict that is latent is not recognized. It can exist, but it doesn't have to be recognized. It just is some of those day-to-day reactions that simply we ascribe to some other nature or we simply don't accept. Okay? Perceived conflict, the second stage, is when a channel member senses the opposition of a viewpoint, perceptions or intentions of their channel partner. Perceived conflict can also be functional conflict, which I'll give you the definition in a minute. It tends to be cognitive in nature. It is the perception that you and a channel member have some kind of opposition or think in an opposing way to a given situation. Well, excuse me. Perceived conflict is unemotional. It is just the recognition that conflict exists. Felt or affective, AF, not EF. Affective conflict is an emotion, and this is when conflict starts to get bad, when it becomes an emotive quality. Felt or affective conflict includes anger, frustration, anxiety, hostility. They are emotive context. They do not manifest themselves in actions, but they manifest themselves in emotions. And then finally, manifest conflict is not well, it has emotive context to it, but it is expressed visibly through actions, behaviors, the deliberate blocking of each other's initiatives, the withdrawing of support. Everything up until manifest conflict can simply be the cost of doing business. But at manifest conflict, what you have is you have one channel partner acting in a deliberate way that limits the success of their other partner. Realize that conflict can be a process, that you can start through conflict, get all the way to manifest, and things can change and you can move back in the other direction. You can look among nation states and see how these things ebb and flow. I'm one of those individuals who says, always give your enemy a chance to be your friend. And many times that can happen, okay? And so conflict is a process as much as it is an emotive state. And it is a process that can change. So how do we measure conflict, or what are the ways that we can count the possibilities of what makes it so bad? First, we talk about its importance. How important is the conflict? It is the ultimate arbiter between success and failure. The next multiplier is frequency. How often do we find conflict in our interactions? And third is intensity. How bad is it? I've been in an organization where the conflict between me and another person in the office was extremely intense. And it's not a safe place to be. But the problem is that the importance in which we were arguing was literally nothing at all. And so when was it a conflict or not? I don't know. But the differences of opinion were pretty obvious. But if you break it by importance, the frequency and intensity, it captures the overall sense of frustration. Where and why parties have become in opposition can be pinpointed. Is it because of something important? Is it because we're constantly haranguing? Or is it just somebody on one side is just that way? That's all I'm going to say. There's still a lot. Anyway, for now. So anyway, measuring conflict. So what are the consequences of conflict? The consequences can be good and they can be bad. And we're going to talk about the good side of functional conflict. So functional conflict on the side of perceived conflict can actually be a good thing. You can throw away the old grandfather phases like what was good for my grandfather is good enough for me. We can uproot the soil, dig into deeper, recognize where there's differences. Because if you recognize the differences, you can also recognize each other's contribution. And understand that your success depends on other individuals. You can oppose each other without damaging your arrangement. And you can provide insight from a different point of view. There are many times our worst enemies, bless you, have a vision of us that may not be complimentary, but it might be factual. To resolve functional conflict, it depends on communication and the understanding that we are in this together. That success depends in one way or another on the successful cooperation. It can get worse, bless you. But good channel members prod their partners to achieve better results through functional conflict. And emerging disagreements can be channeled into constructive conflict. And the last thing we'll talk about when we talk about this chapter is the constructive ways in which we can manage conflict in relationships. We talked about functional conflict. Here's the worst part, manifest. The actions that another individual performs can create tension and frustration, especially a misunderstanding of what is the motivation. Remember, I talked about coercive power. We're going to talk about what this is really the essence of coercive and reward power. Remember that unsatisfactory or coercive power reduces the satisfaction of monetary compensation. It reduces the satisfaction of non-monetary compensation. This unsatisfactory relationships diminish trust. And this conflict between two parties can spill into other relationships. The organizational member of your particular organization, which means that every new hire gets to hear about how bad this one is. And although it doesn't need to be minimized, you've got to find a way to manage it, in whatever way that is. And part of what we'll talk about at the end of this chapter is how do you go about managing the conflict. So what are the major sources of conflict? There are going to be three, and I think one more. We'll talk about it. So what are the sources of conflict? Where does it come? The first one is it's rooted in differences of these three things: channel members' goals, their perceptions of reality, and what they perceive as being their unique domains. And so let's look at these three one at a time. Competing goals. I have said this from chapter 1. The major difficulty is that the manufacturers and the end users, in essence, have the same goals. The manufacturers and the end users want their products in as many possible outlets as possible. The intermediaries want to be able to control the flow in their respective trade areas. Each channel member has a set of goals and objectives that differ from the other channel members as well. One of the great examples of this in industrial organizational psychology is what's known as the agency. And so, let me give you a little taste of this. Okay. So, agency theory says that there are two actors. Okay. One is the principal, who is the work creator, and the other is the agent, who the work is delegated to. Okay, the principal and the agent. So, me as an agent am saying, I need to get this particular chapter done, got a lot of work to do. I need to make sure that all these things are covered before my students go to break. My students, as the agents, are saying, just want to get home for Thanksgiving. Let's go ahead and get this done as quickly as we can. Hopefully we can absorb all this and we can get our A's. And so what agency theory says is that conflict comes because we quite simply have competing goals. We have different reasons for doing things. Think of the agency principle theory when you have a manufacturer who is wanting to get as many goods as they possibly can, and they have an intermediary who wants to be able to control their particular trade area. And this is an example, is that we both come into these situations with two not necessarily competing, but perhaps incongruent goals. We always things that we're thinking about that we want to do later. And all of those things have a way of impacting our overall performance. And that's what agency theory is. The difficulty with agency theory also is, and this is the more difficult part, is how does the agent come back and work on the principle? Because it tends to be a one-way situation. And it's difficult for the agent to find some compromise factor to be able to at least be able to have the principal understand their particular goals. It takes the principal willing to step out of that bubble and be able to recognize the agent's needs. And then there can be a true two-way interaction and communication. And that's what the principal agent or the agency theory has difficult, because the tension, frustrations don't come from actual goal clashes, but our perceptions of goal divergence. We perceive that we're not working in the same direction. And many of the times it quite simply comes about because there's a lack of communication. Differing perceptions of reality induce conflict. As a manufacturer, I have my own perception of what reality is. I am an actor in my particular play. And I believe I understand and I know what is the best way in which to achieve success. My intermediary, my specialized intermediaries especially, are saying you shouldn't be using that finance option. You should be using this one. It's much more efficient. We can process much faster this way. And not only that, but I get a bigger cut if you do it that way. And so differing perceptions of reality. Now, those exist in domestic markets, but they can even be huger in international markets, where our own perceptions of reality are basically based around the cultures that we grow in. Like I said before, in the European cultures, many of them, their honesty could be perceived as rudeness to us, when in fact it isn't. In China, or excuse me, in the Asian cultures, it's very difficult to say the word no. And so how do you express a negative in certain cultures tends to be very difficult. And so our perceptions of reality, what we swing upon and perceive as being the proper way, can be hugely different. So how do we serve? We serve this by having a greater cultural sensitivity, a greater understanding of the group in which we are around, and a better communication, or finding a way that we can connect with those around us so that it is all understood. I had a real difficult time. I taught 6 weeks in South Korea, and I had a difficult time a couple of times reaching my students, because once again, my students did not want to say, I don't understand you. It took off 2 to 3 weeks before I got where they were. And that's my fault. And that's something that I corrected, but it took a while. It made me a better teacher too. Intra-channel competition between the groups means that the manufacturers, if you are selling more than one piece of equipment, they may not perceive you as doing the better job, or you're not trying as hard for my products as you do from others. And so I represent more than one television because mainly consumers like to shop. They will move or go somewhere else if there's only one brand of television that I have. And so by my nature, by success, Best Buy's got to have as many TVs as possible in order for them to stay there versus going to buy them online. Suppliers can have difficulty because especially if they're direct competitors. In other words, if not only they're competitors within inter-brand competition, along with intra, but you also have competition that comes from the direct channel as well. You have dual distribution, you have more than one route to the consumer. And so these can stir up conflicts as well, especially in goods like I talked about, like Callaway clubs and those kind of things that are considered the purview of one particular channel. Those can cause it as well. So the fact that there are more than one route to get to the same market heightens the competitiveness. The technological advances make it even more difficult. The omni-channel has come through and swept away just about everything that we perceive. And it's the smart ones like Amazon and Walmart who have found a way to be able to find a reasonable solution. But as I've said before, suppliers and customers like multiple channels. Suppliers increase their penetration. Customers increase the chances of finding one that meets their demands. And the middle people, the intermediaries, basically want to be able to sell everything to the end users, and they get stuck in the middle. So the one answer that comes from this particular slide, or one of the ways that you can reduce that or minimize the effect, is that you can allow some suppliers to only buy certain things or sell certain things, and you can allow other suppliers to sell only certain things as well. So an example of that is you can't buy the high-end Apple MacBooks unless you go to a university like here or go to the Apple stores. Whereas in Walmart, they'll allow them to sell the iPhones and the iPads and the iWatches just by trying to find some way of being able to resolve this. So the interesting thing is not all multiple channels conflict. As a matter of fact, as long as, and I've said this before, if each of the channels goes for a different market segment, then you've got the possibility of not having that internal conflict. So Coke in 1915, 1920, somewhere around there, came out with the first vending machine. The vending machines were actually an amazing technological advancement because they had refrigeration in a small space. At that point, you had refrigeration in giant reefers with like large locations, but not just in a little enclosed place. When they came, the supermarkets got extremely angry, would not allow them in front, or from the beginning actually, because they said, why does this person come inside to buy Coke when they can just buy it outside? Quite simply, Coke was able to, with a good marketing campaign, and to get them to understand that the individual who buys a single cold bottle in the front of your supermarket is a different person than the individual who comes in your supermarket and buys a six-pack. And they said, not only that, but this Coke will draw people to your store. And they had it exactly right. Once again, this is also Coke's use of power, because Coke said, you either put a machine in front or we're not going to sell you to bring them inside. They said, never mind. And they did it, and it's a success. The people who buy a Coke at a vending machine are totally different from the people who buy a Coke and go into a grocery store. So you can actually work together. So I'm not going to worry about this. I talked about the flagship product just a minute ago. It helps to prevent conflict. But I also want to talk about this. Grade mark. So when I worked in Lafayette, Louisiana at a computer store, we had a school that bought from us called Lords. And Lords, like the people that work in my particular store, the owners happen to have children at Lords. They wanted to buy Commodore 64s from us, and we were not authorized dealers. And so we worked on them, but we weren't authorized dealers as well. The Commodore 64 disk drives used to have these plastic pins in them so that they were guaranteed, like after 6 months, the hard drive or the floppy disk drives would refuse to read. We would put in a metal piece, simply replace it, and those drives last forever. So we got a good reputation around Lafayette. Anyway, so they wanted us to sell them these pieces of equipment, even though we weren't dealers. We found a wholesaler in Houston who would sell us 10 machines, give us a 15% discount. We would have those shipped to Lafayette. We'd charge the 15% discount. They would pay full price, and they were happy. This is what the gray market is. The gray market is the sale of authorized branded products through unauthorized distribution channels. Gray markets are usual suppliers. They tend to be authorized distributors and dealers, sometimes from other markets. Now, they're not necessarily arbitrageurs. Arbitrageurs are kind of different. But arbitrageurs are unique and gray markets are unique because, once again, the service supplied is less than the service demanded. So an arbitrager is a trader who will buy huge amounts in one market at low prices and transport them to another market with high prices, or where they are in essence, what's the word I want to use? Contraband, okay? So this is an example. So China, bad drawing of China and a bad drawing of Taiwan, okay? So China makes iPhones that cannot be sold in China. So an arbitrager in Taiwan buys some of those particular iPhones, turns right around, ships those 50,000 back to China and sells them and makes money on the difference. So that's an arbitrager, and that's how it works. Why? Because the service supplied is less than the service demanded. You know, they want to buy the same iPhones that Americans do, and it is restricted in China except through the gray market. Now, it can happen where there's differential pricing to channel members, different geographical markets. You can introduce gray market goods through discount dealerships. There are many ways, but realize this is not counterfeit. This is actual authorized merchandise that's being sold through unauthorized channels, especially in locations like Japan now. To be able to get Chanel and some of the other things, you're also talking about getting those at exorbitant rates. I mean, and that's where the differential pricing comes in. You ship them from areas such as Italy and in Europe, and you ship them to China, and you can sell the same goods at 3 times the price. And that 3 times the price is still not as expensive as it would cost to go to an official dealership in Japan. Now, why don't they do anything about this? Because quite simply, the gray market is a victimless crop. Okay? Who's the victim? It's not the supplier. The supplier is selling what they want. It's not the end user. The end user is getting what they want. And not only that, but the manufacturer is selling it. The intermediaries, who are the wholesalers and the retailers, are selling it. They're just not selling it in that market. Gray enforcement isn't easy, is not easy, and gray markets are common. It tends to be more where restrictions of economies is what creates gray markets. And so, do I consider it to be a bad thing? No, not really. Because if they would have intermediaries to be able to sell those goods in those markets, gray markets wouldn't exist. And so they are there for conflict, even though the intermediaries do protest as being unfair. But the truth is that the economic conditions are set up in Japan where, you know, a Coach bag, quite simply, on the gray market costs 3 times less than a Coach bag in the regular stores. What can you say? And so, the nature of conflict, the consequences, the sources, and now how do we go about minimizing? Conflict creates more conflict. Okay. We want to minimize, or we don't want to minimize, we want to be able to find a management. Okay. We've got to make sure that we can make it functional without being excessive. If it penetrates, it becomes negative, it becomes part of the organizational memory. The acrimony is passed down to other members in that organization. The firms will withhold support, believing that the other party will not commit. And so there has to be a way of managing conflict to move it from felt, effective, or even manifest into some functional conflict. And the first way you do it is you reduce your threats. Threats and rewards are the worst of all of the powers. Threaten means to imply punishments, negative sanctions. And threats are perceived as coercion, and repeated coercion eventually moves the threatened party into a zone of tension and frustration to the point where there is no longer any satisfaction, whether monetary or otherwise, with dealing with this particular partner in this time to go. And yet, it can achieve positive results, but only as a last resort. It's not an end game. It's just a way of staving off future problems, but reduce the number of threats. Balance your relationships if you can. And by that way, no side is perfectly balanced. Each one of us is indifferentiated. They're both powerful and intolerant. And so there has to be a way of balancing these things out. And we'll talk about it in a minute. When you balance the power, much of the conflict is latent rather than manifest. And so use strategies to come up with some form of agreement. Do not worry about this part. We have to worry about unfairness. And so unfairness is the perception that you are not being treated in an equal and equitable manner. Because everybody will accept everything as long as you believe you're being treated fairly. But if one side believes that you are favoring one other group versus you, that is unfair, and that is relationship acid, and it exerts the greatest negative effect on the channel members' cooperation. If I perceive that you're unfair, then every motive will be perceived as being negative. They will believe that you will take advantage of the situations, and you no longer perceive of me as a partner. It aggravates the negative effect. And what happens is your partner doesn't seek just acceptance, they seek retribution. And so now you're talking about a manifest conflict in which both sides act upon each other. Unfairness aggravates the effects of conflict, You must avoid all things. This is another reason why to have good and effective contracts, by the way, because contracts basically and reduces and limits the possibility of unfairness. Okay, so that's minimizing effects. How do we resolve conflicts? Okay, conflicts exist. Okay, try to minimize the effects. Conflict is still there. How do we go about communicating resolutions and how do we effectively deal with it? Well, the first is institution. Make conflict an accepted understanding that that's going to happen between organizations, between people. Anyone who has a difference of opinion, you quite simply accept that conflict is going to be possible. And so you put in your organization the foundational documents that give your particular partners in your organization due process to resolve differences. And then also between organizations, contracts and situational norms so that due process can occur between companies. The policies become institutionalized, and you can also even do things like bring third parties in, such as trade associations, distributor councils, exchange of personnel programs. And so Walmart and Procter & Gamble, in one of the ways that they institutionalize the possibility is that there is a Walmart office inside Dayton, Ohio. I think it's where P&G's headquarters is. And there's a Walmart office right inside there. And by the very same token, in Bentonville, Arkansas, there's a Procter & Gamble office in there. That is an exchange of personnel program. When you understand your partners, it makes it much easier to deal with. You break down the bonds. You build in appeals with third parties. You add referrals. They're conflict management functions, and it gives you a chance to resolve differences. So one of the third-party information things is that you're willing to give away information. Each side divulging something that's risky and sensitive. So one of the great advantages in the PC industry in the 80s, was the IEEE standards that was created when IBM originally came out. They worked with their machines and published all of the technical information about it so that other individuals could actually build things that go inside it. It is the reason why the Apple II sold 800,000 units from 78 to 82, and the PCs from 83 to 87 sold 40 million. It's because they found a way for competitors to mutually agree on having pieces that could be exchanged. A compact hard drive could fit in an IBM PC. A PC's graphic card could fit inside a PDF. It was an amazing cooperation, and it achieved enormous success. It also meant that new technologies could be floated out there. Everybody could look at them and decide whether to accept or reject them. It brought about the modern industry as we have it now, all right? Joint associations, we found a way to contain conflict through institutionalizing it and accepting that it exists. There are also third-party mechanisms. When you can't find resolution between two groups, what you ultimately can try is to bring in a third party, and that's either known as mediation or arbitration. So mediation is when a third party comes in, but only has limited control. They have no control whatsoever, right? A mediator is a third party. They come in, they bring the two groups together. They hope to be able to settle the dispute by persuading the parties to continue the negotiations. or to consider some kind of recommendations that the mediators bring. The mediator has no power whatsoever to enforce. The mediator hopefully will find some common ground that these two parties can continue forward, at least in some way. Not everything can be done like that. And eventually what you'll have, or you might have, is arbitration. And arbitration is taking away the control from the two parties and giving control to a third party. The third party makes the decision. Both parties in advance state that they will honor whatever decision the arbiter makes. There are either two types, one that is compulsory arbitration or voluntary. So compulsory arbitration, parties are required by law to submit their disputes and the decision is final. Compulsory arbitration tends to be in industries that tend to be with connections with national security. So the the railroads, air traffic controllers, they tend to go under compulsory arbitration, quite simply because we can't afford to have them not working. And so that's compulsory arbitration. Voluntary arbitration is a last resort, where parties voluntarily submit their dispute to a third party and the decision is final and it's binding. So back in the 60s, there was a baseball player by the name of Kurt Flood. He was an all-star. In 67, 68, he wanted to move to another team. He played for the St. Louis Cardinals. Back then, the major league owners basically owned your professional rights. You could not move from one location to the other, even if your contracts had run out. And so what Kurt Flood did, he literally gave up his career and he argued that free agency, every person is a free agent, they should have the right to make as much money as they need to. So 1974, 75 comes around, Kurt Flood's career was over in 72. The judges ruled in his favor and you start to see limited free agency, but it isn't everything. 1992 comes along, the baseball strike comes along, the Major League Baseball players leave, and Major League Baseball loses 100 games. And the owners are solid. Marvin Miller, who's the lawyer, can't go anywhere with this. And in desperation, he consults with the players and he asks for just one thing. He wants to have voluntary arbitration between the players and the owners when it comes to salary disputes. The major league owners said yes, and the baseball strike is over. Anybody want to guess how they made out like bandits, okay? Not only did the salaries in baseball rise, but the salaries in football rose, the salaries in soccer rose, and internationally, every athlete's salary magnified by a factor of 200. Players that were getting $200,000 a year, 1 year, were getting 12 million the next year, quite simply because the scales had been so weighed so heavily in the owner's side for decades that the judges would look at it and say, this is ridiculous, okay? It worked that way all the way until about 2012 or 2013 when it finally started to balance out. But this is an example when arbitration broke things, found some way of making things work out, and now that's why we're in baseball as it is. And every major league player of any type owes a debt of gratitude for Kurt Flood for giving up his career. So third-party mechanisms. Building relational norms. Relational norms is a little bit different from institutionalizing. A relational norm is the way that we act together. What are our actions between each other? Are we flexible with the people we work with? Are we willing to exchange information? Is there a sense of solidarity between us and the other groups? if we have relational norms, a way, an accepted way of interacting, because we're all actors on the stage. And if we have a good way in which we can interact together, these daily interactions help to constitute a positive way in which we can resolve our differences. Now, they can be negative as well, but hopefully the relational norms set, especially as all relational norms should be set by the upper limit individuals who are in the organizations. If you encourage this interaction between each other, it filters down. If you find a way to work through your differences, find some common ground, you can achieve great success. And you do it by building in your daily interactions. This is the way good people work together. The last thing, well, second to last thing. Second to last thing is, what are our communication skills for resolving conflict? How do we go about achieving or some breakup of where conflict is? I tend to be a person who doesn't believe in compromise. I firmly believe in winner take all. I either care about it nothing and I'm willing to give it up, or I care about everything. To me, it's one way or the other. I find it works great in my marriage. Okay. Each one of those particular resolution or conflict strategies depends on the situation. So you may find yourself using more than one way. Avoidance just simply means whatever you want is okay with me. And I tend to do avoidance. You know, I'm fine with it. I'm seriously fine with it, unless I'm not, and then I'm really into it. Okay. Accommodation tries to strengthen the relationship by cultivating a dependence on the channel partner, a quid pro quo. You do this, I will do that. And so the accommodation tends to be a much more structured, tends to be a process where there's a communication and a successful exchange between two parties. Competition, of course, is a zero sum. You're only in it for your own goals. You ignore the other party. This is where you're basically the hammer and you're trying to achieve whatever your goals you think are the best. Compromise presses for a solution on each side to an intermediate degree. Compromise does not necessarily give you everything that you want. It rarely does, because that's why they call it compromise. And then finally, problem solving seeks to get it all. Its own good and the counterpart at high levels. And problem solving means also your consideration for the partner and their particular perceptions of reality. And so these are ongoing resolution styles. They are the ways that humans interact together, trying to achieve some form of balance. And depending on whether you care at all, or whether you care a great deal, somewhere in the middle there is a style, hopefully, that will achieve your goals. The last thing I want to say is using financial incentives to resolve conflict is one of the difficulties with reward power, just like you have difficulties with coercion. Reward power must do more than offer a higher price. Economic agreements are good. They're a way of settling disputes, but economic incentives multiply and become difficult to administer because you don't know how far down the network things go. You don't know how deep the well is. And so ultimately rewards and coercions are stopgap ways. The long-term way to achieve success in conflict is being able to institutionalize them and find ways of putting structures into be able to resolve conflict in every organizational structure. And we're done. We're done with conflict. Tuesday, we will finish. We will talk about relationships, and then I'll prepare you for the test. And have a great Thanksgiving. Thank you.